Well, the situation is we're probably going to have to be short because I'm running with little fuel. I haven't eaten all day yet. I had computer crashes until I got here just 3 minutes before Earl did. So we'll be short. I'm probably only going to be going through these myths once. So I want to take my time and enjoy it anyway. Well, we are in a different opera, the second now. It's called The Walküre. And it's a much different time from the time setting of the first opera. It's our times, and a lot has transpired. Wild and woolly human beings have appeared, and some of them are descendants of Albrecht, and some of them are unnamed as to their parentage, and some of them are the descendants of Wotan, and they are called the Wels or the Volsungs, and they were created by Wotan to redeem his honor and the honor of the gods. The Walküre opens in a most peculiar manner. It opens up in a rustic hut up in the mountains somewhere. It's a wild place, and it's the home of a local warlord named Hunding. And the structure of the house is most remarkable in that an ash tree grows right through it. And this ash tree was part of the world ash tree. Now, this is not an uncommon thing in mythology, because if you remember, Odysseus had, for one of the corners of his bedstead, he had a tree that ran through it. So it's a common theme to all mythology. In this case, the ash grows right through the middle of the house, and the tree is an ash. Oh my goodness, we're out of decent pieces of chalk, so I'll have to use an indecent one. And the Yggdrasil tree is an upside down tree. In that its roots, it had 3 primary roots, and one of the roots went into heaven and one root went into the land of the frost giants, and I forget where the third one went. It was an upside down tree anyway. It was, in some configurations, it's pictured as being an upside down tree. And this is the tree that was the pole of all existence. We talked a little bit about this last time. One can see that in the habitat of the human dwelling, which is the physical body, the tree represents the spine, and it certainly goes right through the middle of our being. And if we think about it, if in the sense of the biblical statement of Christ, like I am the vine and you are the branch, it's a very common thing, even among little children, to be understood as offshoots from a common source. And that really our individual existence is connected to that common source, and we indeed are merely branches on a much bigger tree. So the pole of spirit matter is what the Yggdrasil tree means, and we are part of that. Our divine heritage through the hierarchies connects directly back to the divine, and when we find our true nature, it is almost identical and synonymous with that of God. So this is always brought to our remembrance in a microcosm, macrocosm way by the myths of trees running through people's houses. Now, there's a storm that's brewing as the opera opens, And it's almost a direct tie-in, because if we remember, the Rheingold ended with a rainstorm. And this is a thunderstorm, a harsh thunderstorm, and it's associated with activities that are of momentous importance. People say that there's no weather unless there's bad weather, because everything else isn't weather. And truly, tempests represent depressions in the concentration of the air, and those depressions are associated with whirlpools and vortices. And where there are whirlpools and vortices, there is a close connection with the inner spiritual worlds. What happens is one of our new people now, this is a whole new cast, a few of the old-timers come back. Sigmund comes in, and he is wearing tattered and torn clothing, and he's exhausted, and he comes into this house and collapses on the floor right in front of the fireplace. His hostess, Sieglinde, who is really his sister, but he doesn't know that yet, she comes into the room and sees him laying there right on the floor in front of the fireplace, and she starts coming to his aid, and she gives him water to drink. And she wants to heal his wounds, and he will have no part of that. He considered his wounds marks of honor, and he didn't want them to be taken care of by anyone else. Now, as they're talking with each other, and she's trying to nurse him back to health, all sorts of romantic innuendos start coming into their conversation between the two of them. And as she's examining his wounds, he tells her how he was fighting until both his spear and his shield failed him, and he had to succumb and run. Clearly, the aura, which represents the shield, and the spear, which represents the projection of will, are too weak. As we're setting the tone here for a general theme in this myth, because these are the first human beings that are like us, and the shield represents the aura, in that the thicker our aura becomes by doing acts of love, and those acts of love are just simple services to people in need, or they are services to the divine in doing what we need to do for the world. To some extent, that means just living. Every time we digest our food, even, we're doing work for the world. But at any rate, it's a state of his existence that is described in this. She offers him mead to drink. And mead was the sacred drink of the gods in the Germanic and Norse mythology. In fact, in a way, it was also for the Greeks. It was a drink that was made out of honey. And the Greeks also thought about it in terms of nectar, and the people of India think about it in terms of nectar. And what it really means is a flow of spiritual life through the realm of life spirit, and a flow of vital energy through the etheric world, which allows everything to live both in spirit and in form. But mead took on these qualities as a drink among the Norse, and I think especially so since both milk and honey had a quality, or have a quality, that if you can drink raw milk and get unpasteurized honey, they both have a quality that they help you to hold the life ether in your body more. Like, for example, people who do a lot of healing and need to build up a strong charge of vital energy of life ether in order to help people that they heal, and to be able to draw miasmatic ethers off of patients, very often drink raw milk, that is very fresh raw milk, and honey. In fact, at different times people have tried to live exclusively on honey. The Pythagoreans tried to live exclusively on milk and honey for that very reason, and it never quite worked out right. And so the remnants of that notion were mead. Of course, the mead that was drunk by quite a few of the Norse and Germans was actually a fermented mead, and so it was alcoholic. As he's drinking in her looks with his eyes, and they have these really long, suggestive looks, longing looks as they look into each other's eyes. And he attempts to leave, sensing the danger, and she asks who he is and what's going on and who's pursuing him. And he says, Weewold is my name, meaning person of sorrow. And he says that he is fleeing the horrible Hunding. And at this moment, Hunding comes riding up to his home. And as he comes striding in, and Sieglinde immediately tells him, I found this man lying by our fire. And Hunding asks her, did you give him mead to drink? And she says, yes, I did. And this very greatly chagrins Hunding, because according to the tradition, if somebody has once drunk your mead in your hearth, you have to give them hospitality overnight, and you can't put them out into the night. Hunding would just as soon put him outside the door and kill him immediately, because this is the man he's been hunting down. And then something happens. Hunding starts looking at the two of them, and he says how like the woman he is. The same serpent's glance glitters in his eye. And he recognizes that there's something very, very similar in them. And all the while that this is going on, Sigmund and Sieglinde are becoming more and more enamored of each other and more attracted to each other, and it becomes very obvious. And Hunding says, well, I have to give you hospitality, even though I know you're the person I'm chasing. And as long as I'm giving you hospitality, tell me who you are. And Sigmund replies, certainly not free person. I'm generally a person of sorrow. And then he says, I am a child of wolf, who lost both mother and sister in birth. And he lived with his father, the wolf, in the forest. And they lived in the trunk of an oak tree. A most unusual kind of living circumstance. And he and his father used to widely roam through the forests in the wild. And one day he just lost touch of his father altogether. And gradually he was drawn to the company of other human beings, and that brought him much sorrow, because the ways of human beings are filled with much sorrow. Now this is a pretty common myth also. The very people identified with the character of various beasts. And to northern peoples, the wolf was always one of the most powerful of beings. In fact, if you get very far north, it was the bear that people identified with. And so it is not a lie to say that he is both a child of Wotan and that he is a child of Wolf at the same time, and that Wotan was Wolf. But people identified their lineage then according to the power or to the strength of their source. And him being born from the highest, of the divine race of Wotan, he would be then associated with the strongest animal, the wolf. Quite a bit of the Indo-European mythology, probably you might say the European part of it, is associated with wolves. Like, for example, in Persia, all of the early Zoroastrian and pre-Zoroastrian mythology is associated with wolves, and the northern Persians, who were always fighting with the southern Persians, identified more with the wolf element, and the southern Persians identified much more with the dog element. And so it is the process of civilization, you might say, is taming the characteristic of the most virile animal and bringing it to the most faithful animal. And so then we find that same tradition among the Romans, saying that they were also drawing on the most powerful source. Sigmund tells how one day, when he is among the humans, he finds this girl, and this girl was being forced to marry someone she didn't love. And her father, I guess, had allowed it to, father and brothers had to some extent allowed this to transpire, and she had no say in the matter. And what happens when the husband comes to demand and claim his bride, Sigmund says, no, you can't have her. And he starts a ruckus. And then her brothers team up with him and fight against the groom and his gang. And they fight until everybody is dead but Sigmund and this poor girl. But things don't end there. He's a defender of the right. He's a hero in the making. As we remember that Wotan started this race of human beings to be heroes. Like the early ones, Albrecht and company, were washouts. They didn't make it at all, so he started all over again. And so he had a better try this time because he has someone in Sigmund who's willing to fight any fight for the cause of the good and for the cause of justice and for people who are trampled on. And at any rate, some kinsmen of the now defeated groom come to avenge the groom, and Sigmund is now all alone, and he's fighting a fight to the finish with him until both his shield and his spear fail him, and he has to flee. At this point, Hunding announces, I am the head of the kinsmen, and you are my mortal enemy. And he says, I have to give you, by the laws of custom, I have to give you hospitality tonight, but tomorrow at the break of dawn, when the day begins, is when you must leave. And from then on, your head is in my hands, and I'm going to claim it. Interesting that, there are two different kinds of startings for days. Some days start at midnight, and some days start at dawn. It's exactly like the zodiac. If you're looking from the viewpoint of the vertical, that is from spirit, the year starts at winter solstice. And so all cycles of time in spirit begin either at midnight or they begin at winter solstice. But all material cycles, which relate to the horizontal, begin when the sun is at the eastern horizon, either in the day at dawn or when the sun enters Aries at vernal equinox. Now, all along, as these stories are being told, Sigmund and Sieglinde have a stronger and stronger yearning for each other, and it is becoming more and more explicit, this yearning. And she decides to do something about this, and while all the storytelling is going on, she makes a Mickey Finn, an herbal Mickey Finn, for one thing, and she hands it to him in a horn, and he doesn't like what he's seeing, and so he chases her into the inner room, which is the bedroom, and he follows after her. And Sigmund is, all along, just before she's chased into the inner room, while she's making these very much more intimate looks at Sigmund, she gestures and nods her head toward the tree. And when both of them are gone into the inner room, Sigmund is all alone, and he's brooding the promise that his father Wolf made to him before they parted ways. And that was that in your hour of direst need, you will find a sword. And that sword will be there for your protection. Now, while he's sitting here brooding, he notices that the flame in the hearth reflects off of something in the tree. And he goes over to the tree, and there is a sword handle sticking out of the side of the tree, right at the spot where Sieglinde had been gesturing him. And as he's thinking about this, his thoughts return to Sieglinde, and he falls into sort of a romantic rhapsody of love and lust for Sieglinde. Now, this sword in the lowest hour is called the courage of despair, Nothung. And that is a very common theme. Like, for example, when Dante enters into the inner world at the beginning of the hell section, right at the very beginning of the Divine Comedy. In that first section, he enters through a portal of despair. And it's sort of like our powers don't come to us until we've completely bottomed out, until we've been completely humbled, until we recognize that in our resources of our own, in our ego nature, we have almost nothing, and then we call on something divine. And only at that point that we call on something divine with real earnestness, with complete need, that's the only time that we really begin to draw on it. So we have to have a lot of sorrowing and a lot of suffering. We have to have been humbled, and we have to have reaped through sorrow the fruits of our own erroneous ways that have accumulated as painful experiences for us from our past destiny before we can actually get anywhere on the spiritual path. This is why if we intend to be spiritual students, we have to expect a much harsher life, a much more painful life than other people. And if we aren't having a painful life, it's an indication that we're really not on the spiritual path. However, if we're having a painful life and it incapacitates us and we go into the blues in such a way that we become depressed all the time, that's a sign also that we're failing. That's a sign that we're taking our trials egoistically. And it's only when we realize that we have trials and keep calling on the divine inside of ourselves that we really do get somewhere. Sort of like the old ammeters on the car. If it points too far to one side, the side of joy and happiness, it's a sign that nothing's right. If it points too far to the battery dead side, you're in trouble also. But at the moment that Sigmund is not so much thinking in despair, but in the source of despair, that is romance and lust, Sieglinde returns and she says, we're safe. I've knocked them out for tonight. And then she goes and she shows him the sword. And she tells the story of how the sword got there. She said that at her wedding feast to Hunding, which was again a marriage she didn't want, but she was forced into it by need, a strange old man showed up at the wedding feast, and he twirls this sword above him, and he sticks it in the tree, and he says, whoever can remove this sword from the tree is a true hero and semi-divine, or something of that nature. And at this point, Sieglinde starts telling of all of her sorrows and how she hopes that someday that true hero will come along, and that true hero will be the one that rescues her from her plight. Let's see if I can find it here where her song is. It's a very pretty song, and she tells it. Much better than someday my prince will come. I know too, for whom alone he destined the sword in the tree. Oh, if today I might find the friend here, if he might have come from a distant land to a most wretched woman. Whatever I suffered in bitter grief, whatever I smarted under shame and disgrace, sweet revenge would alone atone for it all. I should have regained all I had lost, all I had wept for. I should have won if it were to have found the blessed friend in my arms, if my arms were to embrace the hero. So she's identified with this hero all along, and it's pretty obvious from the way she tells the story that she thinks it is Sigmund, and even though he hasn't pulled the sword out of the tree, he declares his friendship to her and his passion for her all at the same time. And things are now out in the open that they really are drawn to each other. And then a strange thing happens. The hearth has just about blown out now, and the two of them are lying on the floor in the main room, and the door flies open. And when the door flies open, the moon comes in, and it's not just a stage prop to provide light. Because the moon, as we know, according to the occult lore, the moon was once part of the earth. And that the moon is a consequence of the early Lemurian time when people became very sinful. Right at the beginning of the fall of humanity, when we took the sexual power into our own hands under the guidance of the Lucifers, we not only abused sex, but with our selfishness, we became horrible magicians. And the consequence of this hard, selfish, materialistic magic is that it hardened our bodies, and it was hardening the earth at a terrible rate. In fact, that the earth was encrusting, because it had just begun encrusting from when it had been separated from the sun and was in a molten state, and it was encrusting far too fast. And the effect of this magic was that in the place where most of the magic was performed, the earth hardened even more so there, and it continentalized very hard, very swiftly, and this became sort of a heavy lump and on the earth, and it pulled off and it was thrown off into space. I guess basically most of what is the Pacific Ocean and part of the Indian Ocean is where this previous continent of Lemuria used to be. And what happened is that the individuals who were involved with this magic, who were indeed failures to our evolution, they weren't just straggling behind, as often happens. They were indeed failures because they had perverted the divine creative energy to such an extent that it was turned against the wishes of the divine. It had been done they had gone so far into this introversion, into this turning away from the divine, that it was impossible for them to continue on with their spiritual path. The Lucifers, who were associated with the temptation, operated primarily through the ethers, but they had as a home base the moon. Now, it's a strange thing that they should be at the same place that the angels had to be that are associated with our earth, but that's the way it always goes, that the spiritual worlds and the spiritual philosophy is not a philosophy of segregation. You don't take and stuff your problems away somewhere. You live right with them. And so that at the places where the greatest evil is found, there is at least an equal and opposite counterbalancing spiritual positive force, and it's of just exactly the right kind. And since the Lucifers and angels were at one time part of the same life wave in the past, it turns out that now in the Earth period, they are connected together again with the moon, some associated with the stragglers and some associated with the guidance of human beings, the former being the Lucifers and the latter being the angels. I'm sorry I said stragglers, I should have said dropouts. It's an interesting thing that when a moon is thrown off, it means there are failures. Because you see, we each have our work to do. And our work has to do with redeeming the earth. That is the mineral kingdom. Because as we become creators, stage by stage, when we reach different levels of divinity, we are going to raise the minerals to different levels in their evolution. First to a plant-like existence, then to an animal-like existence, and then to a human existence. However, if some of the becoming creators drop out, there is more matter than the rest can handle. And that matter seems to undergo some sort of a punishment. Meaning to say that there is too much actual of the mineral kingdom for the creative hierarchies, the waves to be able, the life waves to be able to handle, and so it has to go back out to chaos, into interstellar space, and be thrown off. Now, it's really interesting that these forces of evil that come from the Lucifers and from the fallen beings are still present and still active. To some extent, in positive, they work for helping us to precipitate and solidify our bodies. It's known, and it's known to doctors to this day yet, that the whole period within the womb is ruled by the moon. And the saline nature of the womb fluid is associated with the moon, and in fact the chemistry of the whole fetus is salty or saline. And after one is born, the chemistry turns away from sodium and toward potassium and stays that way for the rest of the life, except if a person gets a degeneracy disease like cancer, and then the chemistry of the body switches back to salinity again, and all kinds of rapid growths take place. So this is all tied together. If it weren't for the presence of the moon, and there were only the solar forces, we couldn't evolve, because the solar forces would disintegrate things and have things in a totally etheric state, and the vibrations would be too high for us to evolve. But so there's a perfect counterbalance. In fact, if you take the diameter from the Earth's surface, if you take the diameter of the moon and the diameter of the sun, the average, depending on perihelion and aphelion and perigee and apogee, they are exactly the same diameter. And they have just the perfect balance so that we don't become too hardened, or so that we don't disintegrate from too high of an etheric energy level. But this force also works in negative, such that in moonlight, especially in full moonlight, the dark forces, those who perpetuate evil, selfish magic, not only those that are fallen and lost from the moon, but even those on the earth, work on people who are innocent, or I should better say ignorant of what's going on. And that there are a lot of people that under full moons, by looking in the full moons without even knowing it and not having the strength to do it, they become overcome and very subtly moved to doing evil things that they normally wouldn't do. Paracelsus describes it quite clearly, and he describes it in really strong terms when he talks about the ugly things that are perpetuated under full moons by sorcerers through a reflective process. The whole notion that we have of measuring distances and things like that by reflecting laser light off the moon for scientific purposes was thought of a long time ago by the black magicians and such like that. So, at any rate, this same effect is happening to, we're a little far from the story there. None of this is, or little of it is in the notes. The same effect happens to Sigmund and Sieglinde. Sigmund starts singing deliriously of love and spring and all of that sort of thing. And she responds. Here's part of Sigmund's song. In the merry song of birds, his voice resounds. He exhales sweet fragrance from his warm blood. Burst forth flowers, buds, and shoots spring up from his strength. Arrayed with fragile weapons, he conquers the earth. Winter and storm give way to his attack. His bold blows break down the rough doors, even that rigid and defiant parted us from him. So it's trying to set the tone of spring, and let's see, I'll go a little further on here to the lovely song. At the end of his song, he said, "What I hid in my heart, what I am, came to light as clear as day. It struck my ears like the peal of a bell, when in this cold, strange desert place I first beheld my friend." How could you not fall for somebody if they sang something like that to you? And he's talking here about actually the flux of things. This is all quite a, when things leave the vertical from winter solstice, in the winter solstice, we're penned up inside because we can't go out. It's all frozen and cold and desolate and deathly, and we have nothing to do but turn inward and pray for help. And if anything, visualize for the following year. But then when it becomes to be spring, the animals start mating and the activities are all on the horizontal. And it is the time of great fecund activity, not only for the plants and animals, but also for humans. If you remember a long time ago when we were talking about the Greek mysteries, I believe it was last year, we said that they conceived all of their heroes, the one, not the spiritual heroes, but the ones who were to be the Tanists. That is, the ones who were to be the king that ruled the material summer half of the year. That king was conceived at summer solstice and born at Easter, whereas the spiritual king is conceived at Easter and born at winter solstice. So what is happening here is we're leading up to the birth of a spiritual hero. Remember, this year we're talking exclusively about heroes, and therefore we're saying that spiritual heroes are conceived at the vernal equinox, at the start of spring. This is something that one can readily practice if you know the laws of the moon, if you know when a person is likely to conceive by moon cycle, and if you there's a whole art of birth control by looking at moon cycles in the woman's chart and in the man's chart, and then looking 9 months ahead and finding out what would be harmonious for the development of a child. It's much too long to go into, it's much too technical to go into in this kind of class, but the formulas are hinted at in macrocosm by this sort of thing. They progress deeper and deeper into passionate song, and Sieglinde says, "My memory is strangely stirred. You whom I first saw today, my eyes beheld you before." The second thing is that Sigmund replies, "A dream of love reminds me too, in fervent longing I have seen you before." And she comes back and says, "In the stream I perceived my own image, and now I perceive it again, as once it rose from the pool. You present my image to me now." It's sort of like saying that they each see each other in the other. This is a very common thing, that truly what we aren't, the individuality part of ourself, the part that is not manifest in this physical world, is represented by our mates. But the mate is only a symbolic representation of what we are spiritually. Of course, Wagner, being an artist, could utilize this and make them be brother and sister instead of the higher spiritual individuality and the lower material personality. He can let them be brother and sister. As they continue to sing, Wagner gets a little heady here. They start getting into etymologies of names, and they discover that they are both Walsungs or Wolfsungs, meaning that they are both children of Wotan. And then somewhere along the line she remembers that Waltz was the name of the man who put the spear in the tree. And he names it the courage of despair. And at this point, Sigmund begins to realize that he would have a sword when he was in his deepest despair. His father had told him that, and then he begins to recognize that Wolf, his father, was none other than Waltz or Wotan. And this is sort of what it's like falling in love, both in the human sense and in the divine sense. In the human sense, everything that we aren't but are eager to become and that are ripe to become, we attract ourselves to that. Of course, if we have a lot of unregenerate things, we attract ourselves to mates that are our vexation and that are our painful downfalls, but eventually we get attracted to what represents and resembles our true spiritual nature. And so when we fall in love, we're falling in love with what we want to be. When somebody says, I need you, they're really saying, I need this in myself, and you represent that. And the whole etymology of names, when you think about it, we're all children of the gods. And in fact, all names or all words were at one time from divine natures. All of our words, if you trace them back into the ancient language, the names of the gods represented their powers. In the same way that we say that someone is mercurial or somebody is Venusian or martial, when we hear those words, that represents a whole character, a whole power, a whole modus operandi in the world, and therefore those powers became verbs, and when those verbs became solidified as deeds or as objects, they became nouns. And so all of our words in our languages are actually etymologies of names of gods. And then they name each other, and they discover their own names as Sigmund and Sieglinde, which are variants on the idea of victory. They are to be victors because Wotan made it that way. He wanted to have for himself somebody that would overcome the failure that he had in Albrecht and in all of the previous creations of humans. He wanted somebody to redeem what he himself was incapable of redeeming, because he himself was petty and selfish and locked under the law and all like that, and he had to bring in somebody new, a ringer, so to speak, to redeem it all. So the sword clearly is the spiritual fire. It is with great artistic intuition that this goes at a different speed, huh? Oh, okay. They seem to travel at different speeds, I don't know. But at any rate, Wagner points this out by having the hilt of the sword be associated with the reflection of the glimmer of fire. And this is a spiritual fire. To the clairvoyant eye, the spinal column is seen just as a stem of fire, especially for somebody who is unfolded. It is seen as a stem of fire rising up, and then it spreads out in a cup-like flower of fire, and that is the sword, and the cup-like flower of fire is the grail cup. All right. So they call each other Sigmund and Sieglinde, and it is when they leave their mundane desiring, or it is when any of us as aspiring heroes leave our mundane abuse of the creative fire and turn our heart wholeheartedly, our whole attention wholeheartedly toward God, first for help and eventually to help, that we actually draw the spinal fire. But at any rate, what happens is he calls her sister and bride, and Wagner calls for a quick falling of the curtain, that it drops real quickly, because what's happened is the last act, as the curtain is quickly falling, is he's about to place the sword into its scabbard. Let's put it that way. And they are now about to sexually re-engage. And that's the end of the first act of the opera. And it ends with the fall revisited. The first fall is the fall of Adam and Eve, who symbolically represented the early humanity who first took consciously the creative power into their own hands. however, they did so selfishly, and they did so unwisely. And when they did that, it represented a separation from the very common unity that we all share with each other. We began to lose that immediately after we took the ring. This is taking the ring and sort of dangling it on the sword now. We began to lose that sense of unitedness with everything. At one time, it's as the very first of the epistles, I think it's the Epistle of Hebrews. Is that the first one of it? Is it Hebrews or Romans? Okay, yeah. All right, it's Romans then. That in there, where Paul says, before we fell and abused the power, he said we could see right to the very Godhead. And in a very few short paragraphs, he describes our abominations and fall. So the first fall was a fall into carnal knowledge. The second fall, or the fall revisited, anytime we now unite sexually, we do so out of loneliness because we don't have that unity anymore. And in the first fall, we didn't even know of our outer bodies. And it was only in sexuality that we knew that another body existed. It's the only time we sensed it. Now, in the second, or you might say the fall revisited, we recognize in the height of the feeling, we recognize there's somebody else in spirit alive in that other body. And so this awakens in us an inward appreciation of a common unity with other people. Obviously, if there is no refalling, we discover that in ourselves. And we only unite for the purpose of carrying on children. Now, the unity really was never lost, and it's not just a matter that we became unconscious of it, but it bound us together. It bound us together by committing deeds together. There was kind of a complicity. And it bound us closer together so that nowadays, when we interact sexually with someone, it is both an act of very great attraction and it is an act of very great repulsion because it pushes us apart as we need to assert our individuality, but we find ourselves still bound to each other yet by the deed of guilt or by the complicity found in guilt. Obviously, this can't ultimately succeed. The kind of unions that we tend to still enter into for pleasure or to satisfy loneliness or something like that can't continue to succeed. Only when the union is a complete inner union and we reunite and find ourselves connected with the divine within ourselves, and that automatically results in us loving everybody outside, only then can we really be completely successful. I'm going to go a little bit into the second act, and then we'll find a reasonable place and quit and take it up again next time. Now, the second act begins in a different locale again. It begins on a high, barren place of the mountains, sort of just above the tree line. And there are 9 sisters. And these 9 sisters are called Walküre. To phrase that comic tape I was telling you about, not only did Wotan procreate and produce the Welsongs, he also procreated and produced the Walküre. In that case, his union was with Erda. Remember Erda from the first opera? She's the one that warned him he better get rid of the ring, or he's threatening the foundation of heaven and earth. Well, shortly thereafter, he had a yearning for knowledge about what was going on, and he got together with Erda again, and they united, even though he's married to Fricka. They united, and they must have united more than once, because as a consequence of their union or unions, 9 sisters were born. And they have all kinds of really long names. I'll just give you, they don't give them all, I think. Where am I here? Well, they're not given right away in the beginning. Yes, it's just Wotan and one of them. His favorite of them, who's called Brunhilde. Now, these 9 sisters, on one level, represent the 9 planets. Because as they fly through the air, they take the heroes from, whoever dies as a hero, that means dies fighting, the Valkyries take them and bring them up to heaven, that is to Asgard and Valhalla, and there they sup at the table and they live with Wotan because they died in honor. And they sing as they go through the air. So clearly they represent planetary spirits because each planet has its keynote and it is emanating great truths. These are sort of like birds that sing to whoever can hear the music of the spheres. And if you're listening to the music of the spheres, you're not just listening to sublimely beautiful music. You're listening to great truths. And you're listening to truths that give you insights into the foundations of the whole cosmos, what has been and what is coming to be. So these sisters, once you hear that, you are yourself pretty well on the way to divine. But there are also angels of death, and in that they carry the heroes up to heaven. And you might say they're analogous to the different rungs on the ladder of the gods that leads to complete liberation from all of the earths, from all of the conditions of the earth. And in that regard, they each represent one of the mystery schools. For the lesser mysteries, there are 9 lesser mysteries, and each step is associated with one of the 9 planets, and they each lead us to, as heroes, as those who overcome, they lead us away from the earth to our divine home. So high on this rock, Wotan is telling his favorite Brunhilde, there's going to be a fight today at dawn, and I want you to save Sigmund and take Hunding. That's his instructions. And Brunhilde is only too glad to do that because she loves the heroes. And as she leaves, she sees Fricka coming. And she warns Wotan, look out, Fricka's coming and she's looking mean. You remember how Fricka laid down the law in the first act, in the first opera, how tough she was about selling away love. Well, in this case, Wotan knows what's coming and he vows to hold himself firm. And anytime you have to vow to hold yourself firm, you're in trouble. She comes up and she says, Hunding has appealed to her for vengeance in the name of the law and in the name of love. The law and the love of my wife are such that she should be mine, and my wife has been violated, and therefore I want justice. Now this is just as we would expect it. If Fricka is one of the poles of the nature of Venus, Libra and the seventh house are ruled by Venus. And it is exactly as Paul says in the Bible, the end of the law is love. And that love produced the law. Only love becomes very, very attached to it. And so in this case, Fricka is attached to the law and personally attached to it, and she says her honor is at stake in all of this, and my honor is divine and my law is just. Therefore, you have to take care and see that Hunding is avenged, or that he is, this is the old law, every act gets in a vengeance. You can't rise above that until you get to purely to love. And Wotan says something to the effect, well, the act between Sigmund and Sieglinde, it was an act of love, wasn't it? And who has to make amends for love? And she gets terribly outraged by this argument, and she sees through this, and he keeps saying, no, it was an act of love, and therefore it was all right. And she stands by the law, and she brings in incest. And she says, when has that ever happened before? And he's ready for her, Wotan is Mercury, and he's got an answer, and he says, something blessedly new has happened. Of itself, let's bless it. He wants his hero to live is the last little line of the wolf songs. He wants his hero to live. Now, incest, as we know, has several meanings. On the deep spiritual meaning, it is exactly as we looked at it last year when we were looking at all of those wonderful, wonderful creation myths. Incidentally, I got some feedback from somebody who's named after part of the ancient Vedas, and that got positive feedback about our interpretations of the incest in those creative myths. And we said that at that time, incest meant an internal division of the one into will and imagination, and out of that supreme creative make-believe for keeps is how everything was born into the cosmos. On the other hand, there is the kind of incense that Fricka is talking about, and that is when people are no longer divine. And they start marrying within bloodlines and doing so with great ignorance. They're likely just by chance, which is the ultimate manifestation, you might say. When people start inbreeding and start producing freaks and start producing people who are mentally deranged and things like that, as it used to happen with the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns and people of that nature, that's the purest kind of destiny you can see. If people become, through the act of generation, if they become so selfishly intertwined to maintain power over kingdoms and to maintain great wealth, that they produce freaks and imbeciles and such like that, that's a perfect statement of destiny. That's the height of ignorance, and that's the height of materialistic selfishness and such like that. It used to be that people could interbreed, but they knew the etheric laws and they could magically control so that there wouldn't be those abominations. And when that was done, it was always done in the service of God, and it was usually done in temples, and it was a much different matter then. But as people became more and more closed off from the spiritual worlds and more selfish about their expression and sexuality, that incest became abhorrent, and it became part of the myths everywhere that no, incest is definitely a no-no. But at any rate, after he says something blessedly new has happened, bless it, she blows her stack. And she then brings in she's not going to let him have his cute arguments. And she says, you're trampling on me, because the law is an extension of me. My whole being is in the law, and therefore, if you jest about the law or if you trample on the law, you're trampling on me. This may sound a little sexist, and perhaps it is, but there are certain arguments that are common to males, and there are certain arguments that are common to females. And I noticed that when there are arguments between males and females, this is always the direction that the female takes the argument. What's wrong with me? You have done something and you have offended me. If a man is unfaithful and sleeps with another woman, the woman says, what have you done to me? When if you were to be perfectly logical about it, you would say he hasn't done anything to her. He's done it to somebody else. But you know what I'm trying to say? There are false arguments that males make also, in that there are mirror image reflections in them. But Wagner, when he's writing these things, he isn't just writing political treatises, and he's not just writing spiritual treatises. He is actually talking about human nature, and he does it up in really grand style. He says he doesn't get it. He says this is something new because a hero is needed. He carries his argument further. Now, I'm certainly not speaking in favor of incest. But what Wagner is saying as a mystic through the mouth of Wotan is very beautiful, and it's very profound. You see, our fall was never intended within the divine plan. And the law, as we know the law, is just the skeleton of that divine plan. It's one of the principles within the divine plan. When we went against the plan and freely chose to work against the plan and against the law, we put ourselves in the exile that we're in now. We're wearing the Tarnhelm now to God because God can't see us as we are or as we see each other in our physical bodies. So we have stepped outside of the law. Therefore, something very special has to be done to redeem us from being outside of the law. And so this is what Wagner is hinting at, because it is only someone like us that in our sin and in our separation from the law, it is only someone like us that can create something new that wasn't intended by the gods in the first place. And in a very special way, we become the darlings of God by creating in that special way outside the law. And our redemption, true, it's through the creative potency of Christ, which is another very special case that was necessitated by our falling away from the law. Yes, it's true that we use the creative agency of the cosmic Christ, but when we create in freedom. It may be because we can't stand the pinch of the law, but we still create in freedom. So we sinned in freedom, and we create in freedom, and therefore the creative deeds are the things that redeem us, redeem the gods, and we bring something really fresh to the cosmos that no other being brings to the cosmos. Because we're fresh. Because we are in a state that no other is in. And if we begin to be creative beings and manifest that creativity in ourselves as a divine service, we do something that almost no other being in the cosmos can do. And this is a really, really important thing that is hinted at here, even though it deals with one of the most repulsive kind of things, the suggestion and tongue-in-cheek laughing about saying, hey, incest is all right. But what it really is saying is that this kind of union that is outside of the law, because our union inside of ourselves, we have to find a way to bring the creative energy up in a way that has not been done before. That kind of act is indeed a special case. Doesn't mean anything to Fricka, though, if she says it is divine defiance, and she stays with that, and she's right. It was out of sin that creation was born, and that's still defiance. He shames her in the name of courage. And he says, you should be ashamed, because this man is more courageous than any other man on earth. And she calls that trickery. She says, I'll have no more of your trick arguments. And she tries to disarm him. And they go back and forth. And she says, take away the creative energy. Take away the power of the sword. And that's not the way it is. They bicker about that not being the way it is. And finally they come to a point where she says something here. They bicker on a point. And he said, I didn't make him do it. I didn't make him get into incest. I didn't make him pull the sword in the first place. And she said, you created the need for him, just as you did the sword envied of all. Would you deceive me, who night and day have followed in your footsteps? You thrust the sword into the trunk for him. You promised him the sublime weapon. Will you deny that your craft alone lured him where he might find it? And in short, she's saying, no, you didn't directly make him do it, but you set it up so that it couldn't be any other way but that. So finally, the chain of events is that it comes out that he actually was put in that way. And eventually, Wotan, no matter how tricky he tries to argue things, eventually he has to succumb because he's a creature of the law. He's within the law, just the same way that Fricka is. Only Sigmund at this point is the outlaw, and we have to hold on to that for a while because it's going to come back much later. She makes him promise to obey the law lest the gods fall. And that's true if the gods themselves were to step outside of the law and try to become pure creators. Without the law, everything would fall into chaos. Because the law represents the skeleton. It represents the organization that is within the whole divine plan. And if you take the key element, cause and consequence, out of a whole causal activity, a whole divine plan, then the plan itself must fall because it is founded on that very thing. And she leaves, and as she's leaving, she signifies to Brunhilde to go and take new orders. This is very clever because she's like the law, she's like Libra, she stays with the protocol, she's got the perfect manners, She's got the perfect manners and says that I'm not going to give you the order. Wotan's going to give you the order. Let's break at that point and finish the opera next week, because it's a good breaking point. If we get a little further on, I think we would find it hard to break off. So next time comes the big battle and its aftermath.